All right, welcome everybody, and thank you for tuning in today. You are listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Sonics Community Radio with Global Soul. This is the Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer, and I am here today with my special guest, Dacre Stoker. Welcome back, Dacre. Thank you so much for being here today with me.
Well, hello, Adam, and thank you so much. It's always great to chat with you. We've had fun together down in Savannah and on the radio, and it's always good to get back into your ear.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And everybody tuning in at home, you might not know this, but on Tuesday, May 26th, I believe that's the date. Is it Tuesday, right?
Wednesday.
I'm sorry. The 26th. That is the World Dracula Day, everybody, when Bram Stoker first published Dracula. And so Dacre's been on like the last couple of years. You've come on and we've talked about like all things Dracula. You are a multifaceted person, and you have a lot of cool things that you do. I thought it was so awesome how because for those of you who don't know, Dacre Stoker, you might notice the name Stoker. He is the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, and you've carried that legacy on. I think it's so cool. So I really appreciate you being here today, and I know you've got a lot of stuff that you've been working on. So,
Well, absolutely. It's not always just building up to World Dracula.
Right, right.
It's a year-round thing, and
right.
It just happens that around May 26th, and this year it's the 124th anniversary of Bram publishing Dracula. Lots of people in the world are interested in Dracula, but you tend to get a lot of attention when somebody, and I don't know who started it, it wasn't me, who starts something like the World Dracula Day, or
right.
Mother's Day, Father's Day. You then focus your attention, at least in social media and sometimes on TV and so on, radio and print. It becomes a day to sort of, let's look at this a little closer. And on this day, it's kind of cool to think, that this, my great granduncle, born in just outside of Dublin, Ireland, a sickly child for the first 7 years of his life, almost didn't live. And I think part of that, Adam, had to do with, potentially his respiratory allergies, asthma, possibly. It's never really been diagnosed what caused this illness for Bram. But I tell you one thing that it did: it isolated him in his family. They lived in a 3-story home in Clontarf, as I mentioned, and he was up in the top floor. His mother tried to keep the place clean so he wouldn't have all these allergens. He didn't go outside much at all, didn't stand upright that much. And so that sort of caused him to have a very dark sense of imagination, along with the fact that his mom and his nanny told him all kinds of bizarre stories. These are Irish folklore, mythology, and if you ever study those, they're not the little leprechauns and happy little fairies like you'd see at Disney World. This is it is very close to Irish versions of vampires and cautionary tales about afterlife and making sure people did the right thing, otherwise they'd get their blood sucked out of them. So in a way, you can kind of almost be thankful that this little boy survived, and he went through one heck of a process to survive, and that, I am convinced, played a large role in the writer that he became. And then, of course, many years later, 1890 till 1897, he actually wrote Dracula. It took him about 7 years because, as you know, Adam, he was not a full-time writer. He was a theatrical manager for Henry Irving. That kind of satisfied his dramatic and sort of the art side of his life. His writing was something he did on the side.
And what I think is really interesting, and we started to, but we didn't really get that deep into it. But you kind of had like this dual role with because you deal with the nonfiction and the historical aspects of like Bram Stoker, and then the literary work of Dracula, and then a lot of the other things that have been derivatives off of it. But you also are a published author with a couple of best-selling books out there as well on the fiction side. Could you like explain or kind of just give us an insight on where you see yourself at in the world with that? I mean, because you've got a lot of different things that you have going on with it.
Yeah, that is true. I when I retired from being a school teacher, I taught physical education and science and outdoor ed. I still have a lot left in me, and it was like, okay, now's the time because my wife she's from the Charleston area, Charleston, South Carolina. She's big into genealogy,
Mm-hmm.
and she said, "Look, we've got to sort of dig into some of our legacy." And it wasn't just digging into Uncle Bram; it was Bram's youngest brother, who was my great grandfather, and his son, who is my grandfather. So it was like, okay, now's the time. We got some time on our hands? Let's do it. And of my dad's generation, he died when he was quite young. One of his brothers was sort of the holder of the mantle, so to speak, the keeper of the papers. Well, he was slowly dying with congenital heart failure. So he actually sort of summoned me and Jenny to fly up to Montreal, Canada. And at that time, he sort of said, "Look, I want you to go to this storage facility. Here's the combination for everything. Here's the keys." Adam, it was like, sort of like that Indiana Jones movie where they walk into that
Oh,
warehouse
wow.
and there's all these boxes. Well, there
Wow.
was probably 20 of these big trunks and things, but it was equally as fantastic because everything we opened up, there was more cool stuff. We actually found a letter from Hall Caine, Ellen Terry, Henry Irving. There was stuff in there because I guess everything sort of accumulated to
Mm-hmm.
the eldest living brother. And so we went through all this, and the more that day we spent there, and then we brought stuff back, scanned it. The next week was like, okay, now here's where we need to go with this, and it just seemed to coincide also with a big celebration that was about to start in Dublin, Ireland, called One City, One Book in 2009. Now, I had already gotten into writing with Ian Holt, Dracula the Un-Dead at the time, but going to Dublin, Ireland, this was my first visit to meet family, to go to some of the places where Bram went. My research up until that point had been mostly on the internet and going to the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. But this was the trip to Ireland where I really cut my teeth with meeting other scholars who were there to celebrate Dracula. And I really realized at that point that a family member needed to get more involved, needed to learn more, because as Jenny said, if you don't do this, then a whole generation of Stokers will sort of lose that contact, and then my children will have very little chance to recover from that.
Mm-hmm.
So, my first effort was in the fictional world with Ian, but when I decided to, because I got lucky and actually discovered Bram Stoker's Lost Journal, work with Dr. Elizabeth Miller, who was really one of the foremost experts in the world in Bram Stoker and Dracula. So talk about cutting your teeth in the scholarly world.
Mm-hmm.
That really put me in the other camp. I sort of had one foot in the scholarly camp, which gave me access to all kinds of very interesting researchers, Robert Etienne-Bazang, who passed away last year, and Christopher Frayling, some of the fellows who have written biographies. So I got access to them. They recognized that I wasn't just fooling around, and they would share information, and we would share back and forth. But I became sort of the family spokesman. So people looked at me to go and give these lectures, these presentations, and of course that was what I did as a school teacher. So it was easy, and in many ways, I really felt I had a leg up on some of these other folks, because researchers don't always make the best presenters, but I felt I did a very good job, in front of a classroom, in front of a room full of interested fans.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to help share some of their findings, and I certainly give them credit. And so to kind of sum this whole thing up, I continue to write fictional and work in the nonfictional world, but it's kind of like I'm playing with a big jigsaw puzzle.
Mm.
And if Hans de Roos finds something, which he did, he was the guy that discovered the Icelandic edition of Dracula being similar to the English one. He was the one that found the Dracula notes that helped lead us to the location of the fictional Dracula. And same with Miller, was saying all these people,
The
they had
Hans
pieces of
Roos,
the puzzle.
De La Roos one, that was the Power of Darkness.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you did an extensive intro on that, didn't you?
Well, you see, that's what I mean is that I get
Yeah.
into the situation where these guys want me involved, but I don't just write, a little, oh yeah, I'm Dacre Stoker, happy to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
along.
yeah.
I decide, look, I'm going to get knee deep or waist deep in this. I do the research with them. I find some interesting things that I can bring in from the family, like, hey, Dacre, have you ever found a manuscript from this Icelandic edition, or
Mm-hmm.
any other manuscript exists of Dracula? And it was like, no, but I'll get to my cousins, and I may end up flying to England and going
Mm-hmm.
just two different homes, looking through their boxes. And of course, that's how I found the lost journal. But yeah, that's kind of what I do, to kind of long-winded. Sorry, but
Oh
it's like,
no, no, I love it. I mean, because from my perspective, I've been a lifelong reader, and I love I mean, I grew up with Dracula. You know what I mean? Dracula was
yeah,
always
yeah,
around. Dracula's one of those iconic, classic, not just the monster, but it just really, in my opinion, the story itself reveals a lot about humanity, and it also is a great time capsule of what it was like for people, 125 years ago or whatever. And I love the fact that you present that in the storytelling with the historical side of it, with the research. You present it as like, okay, well, these were the things that were going on. Like even when you first started talking today about, how Bram was a young boy, and I know you said before that they thought he might have had hay fever or asthma, or they didn't really know exactly, but I felt like that those deep down details, those little morsels, those are what people love, because it's like, oh, did you know, kind of thing. I love that
well,
kind of stuff.
are you ready to delve into a more recent one?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Well, let me share this with you, Adam, because obviously I know you appreciate it, and that's why I like chatting with you. But again, here's another little nub of it, and it's all it's things that have been discovered by other people
Mhm.
that have you know cared enough about me and realized that I will handle it properly. And when it's time to tell their name, some people don't like their name. Some people I can't tell exactly where because their paper hasn't been published yet.
Mhm.
But here's a few more pieces of the puzzle, and it starts really with putting in perspective when Bram wrote the novel. And as you said, yeah, it is a snapshot of the late Victorian era, the late 1800s. But what was going on in people's minds? What was some of the predominant thoughts at that time? And one of them was, it's not far off from what your friends and mine in Savannah do, which is paranormal investigation. The same concept was happening with spiritualism, the occult, seance, the afterlife. All that was going on. This was the time of Houdini. This was the time of the Order of the Golden Dawn. People were very interested, and they were educated. Science was beginning to reach out. Mesmerism. Joseph Mesmer was thinking of ESP and thought control.
Mhm.
There was all this cool stuff going on, and Bram was very interested in it. So, or Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a good friend of Bram's, was obviously very tied up in all that. But this sort of what was also happening was religion was beginning to be challenged, and so that old way of you got to do this, you got to do that, it's God's will, it's God's way, don't question. Well, people were questioning, and this whole concept of good versus evil and faith in God. Well, people were beginning to wonder, well, what really happens to us after our physical remains wear out? Where does that spirit go, and what happens? And therefore, this novel that Bram wrote, this whole idea of immortality, the afterlife, uh, has a little more resonance to it, because people are thinking about what goes on. And also, Bram himself, I know, suffered from nightmares. I know he had a very interesting concern about the afterlife and what goes on with the spirit. And I know he was concerned and interested in the presence of goodness versus evil. In his own Bible that I have seen with my own eyes, there are only two passages underlined, and they have to do with good versus evil, and resisteth the devil.
Mm.
Resist the devil. That's it. And
Wow.
so that was one little discovery. It wouldn't have meant anything on its own, Adam. But when Philip Spedding, who was the head fundraiser working at the London Library, just now it's been 2 years, contacted me and Robert 18 Pasang from Vancouver, British Columbia, and said, guys, I found something really interesting. And that's all the books that Bram listed in the back of his Dracula for notes, his notes for Dracula. I've discovered them in the London Library.
Wow.
And first thing is, like, how do you know they're his? Well, unlike other libraries that you and I know about, even, you're not old enough, but you'll remember that those little sleeves in the back of library cards.
Yeah, we had those.
Books,
yeah.
The little sleeve and a little stamp, the date stamp. London Library didn't have those because it was a private library.
Oh.
And what you do is you'd go in and you'd take out a book and you'd look at it. If you wanted to take it home, you simply went to the person at the front desk and they'd write, Dacre Stoker taking out Dracula. So what Philip did was he went through all the aisles of the hundreds of thousands of books and found the 26 that Bram had listed in his notes, and that they had record of him taking them out, and he started looking through them. And you know what he found? A bunch of notes in the margins.
I was wondering if he...
Notes.
Oh, no way. No way.
Yes, man. And so it was a little embarrassing at the beginning for me, thinking, oh, God, they're going to tell us that, Bram Stoker's a naughty boy. But he said, first of all, it was only in pencil.
Yeah.
He didn't really do a lot.
Permanent damage.
Right, but he needed my input because he knew that I had a few books that Bram had,
mm-hmm.
and he wanted me to verify the methodology of his little cryptic messages, check marks, NB for nota bene, sometimes even a little drawing. We also know to verify that these were his that Bram's son, Noel, donated 2 books to the London Library that were dear to Bram after Bram died, and they had exactly the same types of markings.
Oh, wow.
As did the 2 books that I have of Bram's. So that, beyond a reasonable doubt, this is Bram's markings. So I got on a plane, and Robert got on a plane. We flew over there. We were doing research anyway on our own annotated Dracula that will be coming out in a year or so. But we spent 2 days there going through these, and I got to take pictures of the pages that had the most interesting things underlined. You know what I found, Adam?
What?
A lot of references to the devil,
Mm.
references to volcanoes, references to parts of Transylvania that had volcanoes and had geologic occurrences. Earthquakes, volcanoes. See, this was a time of the world where there was more science beginning to be developed, but they still had a connection to this sort of what's going on in the supernatural world, and could these earth-shaking things, could these volcanoes, could these things be symbols of the devil?
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, they were obviously becoming more enlightened, but still it was a lingering thought that volcanoes were portals to hell and the home of the devil. So as I read through these, and then I found another book by a medical doctor that actually had a whole chapter on vampirism, ghosts, mesmerism, somnambulism, trance walking. So it was like this light bulb went off. Bram didn't just make up all this stuff. He was somewhat fixated with the devil, with volcanoes, but when he read books by men of the cloth and men of medicine, respected people, and people who had traveled to this part of the world and gone to great detail about what this part of the world was like, it was this major aha moment for him and me to realize that Bram was trying to tell a story that felt real.
Yeah.
That could actually be real.
Yeah.
And of course, as you well know, that was the basis for J.D. Barker and I to write Dracula. But really,
fantastic novel, by the way.
It was what Bram was telling us.
Yeah.
So that's one of the latest things. And I'll say one more. I'll give you one more tidbit, and then we can get on. That a researcher in this country, and I can't tell you her name at exactly the library yet, but has uncovered a trove of letters that Bram Stoker wrote between people in English society who were known to be, I'd say, experts or very interested in the occult. Now, that doesn't mean they were horrible people who would take a cat on Friday the 13th and gut it and sacrifice it.
Right.
They were simply deep thinkers that were interested in, the tarot cards and seance and possibly, mind reading other people's minds, where the spirits were, what that was all like. So that it wasn't like they were, totally weirdos, but it meant to me, when I looked at the dates of these letters, and I've been able to get images of all of them and read them quite thoroughly, Bram was very interested in this stuff. So his writing of Dracula, he didn't get interested in this just to write Dracula. He was interested in this during his university days at Trinity through writing of Dracula.
Mm-hmm.
So would I say he was an occultist? Nah, probably not. Would I say he was very interested in it? Yes. Did he use it to his advantage? Yes. Did he capitalize on it to include this into the novel because he knew he would touch a nerve, touch a chord with all of his readers? Absolutely. He was a theater manager first and foremost. He knew his audience. He knew what would push their buttons. He did the same thing with his writing.
I think that's fascinating. And, I've had a discussion. I mean, and I'm obviously not an expert on Bram Stoker or Dracula, but I've had a conversation with different writers and authors before that I argue that Dracula was actually a modern book because of the way that Bram Stoker wrote it. It was supposed to take place at the time that he wrote it in that era. And they were, like you said, with the occult things, the scientific things, like, one of the mentions that he talks about is with the Kodak camera, and then the traveling and the business and, all of those different things. Those were all, it was, not the dawn of the industrial age, but, maybe 30, 40, 50 years, afterwards, people were used to having different, instead of just an agrarian lifestyle, they're used to like city life and, and then here he's going over, to Transylvania, and it's like, this is the old country. And, it's like the American tale, the old country versus the new country. I always thought that there was a lot about immigration, like when, a lot of that sentiment in there and, a lot of the things that were going on. Like you said, he was, first and foremost, he knew his audience. So these were issues of their day that they were dealing with, like the occult thing. I think about TV shows like, like Ancient Aliens or like these ghost shows or whatever. People watch that kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that they practice it or they believe in it. And for that,
they're interested in
right.
it. They want to know more,
right,
to draw their own conclusions. And I think you're right. The same thing was going on with, as there was more travel going on, there was more people from Eastern Europe becoming mainstream. At that time, for the listeners, sort of the Western world sort of ended at Budapest, and which was, Hungary was right next to what was, wasn't Romania at the time, but it is Romania now. But people sort of didn't know what was going on beyond that. And luckily, Bram had at least 5 books by travelers who went there and went into great detail. But he still created this story that was far enough away so that it was very different, that had a lot of superstitions. I think one of the books that had a big impact on him was written by a Scottish lady, Emily Gerard, called Transylvanian Superstitions. And another cool little tidbit, Adam, that I've just found out in the last 6 months. It's one of the good things about the pandemic is you're kind of glued at home and stuck to the computer and Googling. And this one, I didn't have to go to Marcia's library in Dublin. Too bad, because I love it there.
Yeah.
But Oscar Wilde's mother, Lady Jane Wilde, wrote a number of books. She's a very interesting lady, and she was very close, or Bram was very close to her. Bram, the only connection Bram has to Oscar Wilde is that he scooped away Florence Balcom, who was dating Oscar Wilde at the time.
Oh, wow.
But he went to school with William Wilde, Oscar's older brother, and Mrs. Wilde used to hold all kinds of interesting parties for the literati of Dublin. And Bram was included in that because he was this aspiring writer.
Mm-hmm.
He was a student, he was an athlete, and he was also stuck working in Dublin Castle as a clerk in the Petty Session Legal Department because the Stoker family needed money. The father retired from the very same place. He wasn't a clerk in Petty Sessions. He was actually a much higher up civil servant. But Bram got to work because the other brothers were all in medical school. So Bram needed an escape for his artistic side of his life, and part of that was satisfied by Lady Jane Wilde. I found out that one of the books Lady Jane Wilde wrote was all about Irish folklore and superstition, and she actually referenced in that book the similarities to Transylvanian superstition and vampires, to Irish superstitions and vampires.
Oh, wow.
So that might have been Bram's initial trigger to start looking at this, which he ended up doing not for another 20 years, but it might have planted that seed.
I find it fascinating because, when not just this story, but, any story, when you find out the other little details and you're like, wow, maybe if this hadn't happened, this wouldn't have happened. All these little things just, they seem so coincidental, but they also seem like, in a way, because I'm a believer and I just feel like sometimes it's just divine order, You could say it scientifically. It could just be like whatever you want to believe, good karma, whatever. But, all of these things that happen and unfold in our lives, like we met because of Ryan Dunn. He was like, hey, did you know Dacre Stoker's coming to town? And I was like, no, I didn't know that, and we've become friends because of that. Things,
right.
Things just happen sometimes and you're like, wow, if this hadn't happened, then I don't know. I just find it fascinating.
No, you absolutely were. You're never quite sure if it was meant to be or, because Ryan's into paranormal investigation, I'm interested in that. Bram was interested in that. And then your world, Ryan's friends, kind of all kind of work in a similar circle. And it may make sense with us with similar interests. And then, of course, that wonderful Savannah Book Festival and, and you publish books. So, yeah, it was all probably meant to be.
I think it's great. And, talking about the pandemic, we've got to do the station break real quick, Dacre. And then when we come back, I want to ask you, like, what you've been up to the last, 3 or 4 months, 5 months or whatever. I mean, we can,
Sure.
We'll play catch up a little bit. And then everybody stay tuned because the next hour, Dacre is going to be on again. We're going to continue on, but what we're going to do is we're going to be talking with him and Chris McAuley, who is a very creative person as well. And they've got a lot of new projects that they have. So stay tuned, y'all. We'll be right back. Sebastian's going to play a little bit in the studio, and then we're going to do the PSAs, and we'll be back with Dacre Stoker after the break. It'll probably be about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay. All right. Here's Sebastian Messer.
Thank you for listening to WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
This portion of WRUU Savannah Soundings programming is provided by listeners and by Brighter Day Natural Foods. Brighter Day Natural Foods has been serving Savannah's healthy food and supplement needs since 1978. It is located at the corner of Bull Street and Park Avenue. They have available online ordering and curbside delivery, and now a walk-up window for smoothies, juices, and sandwiches from the deli. They are open from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday, and 12 to 5:30 p.m. on Sunday. More information can be found at brighterdayfoods.com.
What does it mean when we say that WRUU is a community radio station? It doesn't just mean that we invite the community to create programming. And it doesn't just mean that we are a voice for the community. It also means that we are counting on the community to keep us going. And you are the community. Almost all of our modest budget comes from small annual or monthly donations from listeners like you. You get to enjoy our community-focused programming because many others have stepped forward to do their part. Now do your part by joining our community of listener donors. Go to wruu.org right now and make a one-time or monthly donation. And thank you for supporting Savannah's community radio station, 107.5 FM.
Wilderness Southeast offers a variety of programs each month, including guided trips with naturalists. The organization's goal is to develop appreciation, understanding, stewardship, and enjoyment of the natural world. More information is available by calling 912-236-8115. Wilderness South.
All right, everybody, we are back, and we are live here in the studio, WRUU. This is the Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer, with my very special guest, Dacre Stoker. Dacre, man, you've just really blown my mind with some of these details, especially like the annotated notes of Bram Stoker in his books that he used for research from the London Library, and it's just amazing, some of these things that, and how do you feel when you come across these different facts and these different, pieces of the puzzle, like you call it?
Well, I tell you, it's an amazing feeling because it gives me the feeling that I am right there getting deeper into Bram's mind. Having been a teacher and a coach in my life, I found some of the best things to do is to, figure out how the people I'm working with are wired, and I can help them, learn or help them achieve athletically. But with Bram, it's like everything I find, I get closer to him. The Dracula notes that I didn't find, but the Lost Journal that I did find. And now when Philip Spedding found these notes in the margins and things, it was like, here's Bram sitting there with the pencil, and this is what is important to him. This is why he underlined this. This is why he checkmarked it here. And what was fun for me is I quickly went onto these rare and antique book sites and bought exactly the same editions of these books.
Oh, wow.
I didn't get all 26, but I've got sort of 12 of the most important ones that I felt were, focused on things that directly related to Dracula. Now his son was on record saying, Bram's son was on record saying that for any book that my dad wrote, he did a lot of reading for it. Bram was a real kind of really got very prepared and everything. It was no different than Dracula. So I went and bought the same book because guess what, Adam? We know darn well that Bram took 125 pages of notes, but there was a lot more than 125 pages of notes that made their way into Dracula. A lot of his own thoughts that he didn't put down in notes. I want to know where some of that stuff came from. So I've read from cover to cover all these other books, and I've realized where this information came from.
Wow.
It's obviously got, churned around in his brain. He combines things, he merges things, he takes something from one country, sticks it to another, and that's how it all comes together. And to me, that's great value. And that really does help when, as I know just before the break, you asked me, let's talk about some of your, more the current projects that I'm involved in. When I embark with Chris McCauley, who we will get a chat with in a little while, on adapting one of Bram Stoker's short stories or taking a story we know about from Bram's book, Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving, and want to turn that into a radio drama. I can do that better because I have analyzed Bram Stoker from head to toe and really think I understand him extraordinarily well. And of course, I've read the other biographies other authors have written. I've read as much as I can find about him that I feel is worth reading, and that gives me some great insight into Uncle Bram.
I think it's fascinating because you do a lot of things, and I love that you're always working on putting new stuff out, especially like when you collaborate with other people and you come up with something new. You're like, oh, like you had mentioned earlier that there's going to be an annotated version of Dracula. Now there's like 1 million copies out there of Dracula, right? I mean, everybody and their brother, it seems like they publish a copy of Dracula. I think this is going to be, and we haven't even talked about this, y'all. This is like me and Dacre talking for the first time about this, and I haven't heard about this before. So I feel like with the other books that I've bought and read of yours, the way that you present the documentation, even like when you're talking about getting into the mindset of where Bram was, what he was doing, what he was reading, how he was preparing this, because he, like you said, he spent 7 years writing this book. And then when he published it, he published it in the newspaper, and then he published it as a book. And then, he had all these different things going on. I remember you even talking about it in your speech when you came to Savannah, that he had actually had a little stop or a stay over here in Savannah at one point, right?
That's right. Because as I said, his main job was the manager of the Lyceum Theater, and he organized 8 tours to America, brought Henry Irving and the whole touring group with him. And yeah, they traveled at least once. I've got documentation of them coming through Savannah,
Wow.
Charleston, Atlanta. Irving was the greatest Shakespearean actor of the time. So it would be like, Brad Pitt, George Clooney,
right.
kind of thrown into one. And they happened to be performing in Savannah at the time for a couple of nights and, doing Hamlet or Faust or something else. So, yeah, but all the, what's interesting is, and just as you mentioned, it's important when I study Bram and figure out what is he writing at that time. Mm-hmm. What are the influences that he's getting into now? And if you don't mind, I'm going to segue
please. Please do.
Into the Virgin's Embrace, because on one of Bram's trips with Irving to America and the whole group from the Lyceum Theater, train travel across the country and back and forth, he actually met Buffalo Bill. Funnily enough, he met Buffalo Bill in Long Island.
Oh, wow.
Where he was performing with his Wild West adventure show with Indians and horses and all this stuff. As many of you might know, Buffalo Bill became the model, for this American frontiersman, and that became, or parts of that became, Quincy Morris. Parts of that also became a guy in the story called Shoulder of Shasta out in California, a real sort of outdoors guy with a rather unfortunate name, Grizzly Dick. And then in this story that Chris and I, and we'll be talking more about that when Chris comes on the air, The Virgin's Embrace is an adaptation of Bram's story called The Squaw. And The Squaw is a story set in Nuremberg, Germany, and I am convinced it is either a sort of an imagination, or it was possibly the real honeymoon of Bram Stoker in Florence. And we know that Henry Irving and some of the other members of the Lyceum troupe, the set designer, they all went to Nuremberg to study the look of the old city, because they were about to stage the play Faust at the Lyceum Theater and wanted the authentic feel of the castle and so on. And even though Bram didn't say it, I went with Irving and the group to Nuremberg. Irving and the group never went anywhere without Bram Stoker, but
Right.
Bram said it in personal reminiscence, and he very seldom said, Irving and I did this. So it just makes sense that Bram was there. And the descriptions of Nuremberg are also in Dracula. When Mina is sitting in Whitby saying, and she's looking over the red roof, she's saying, oh, they look just like the houses stacked upon each other, the red roofed houses in Nuremberg. So I think Bram was there. But the bottom line is, young couple, British, on a honeymoon in Nuremberg, and they bump into an American. And the American is Elias Hutchison, and he is very similar to that sort of Buffalo Bill, Quincy Morris character all rolled into one. A bit brash. He's been around. He's fought in all kinds of Indian wars. He fought in Mexican-American wars. He's done all kinds of adventure stuff, and he is a little bit brash. And without spoiling it, the story called The Squaw is obviously because this guy, this American, tells the husband and wife an encounter that he had, a tragic one, with a Native American female. That's why the story is called The Squaw. We changed that name to be more politically sensitive to The Virgin's Embrace. And that was not hard to do that because in Nuremberg there's a very famous torture chamber that is featured in this story. And that this torture device, and Adam, you may know about this, but they were not actually used very much. They were more of a deterrent, but these were these cast iron, female-looking bodies that were about 6 feet tall, and when opened up reveals all these spikes on the inside, and they, of course, have these hinges holding them open. And when the victim is put inside, you would slowly be punctured, and then you'd be inside this sort of sarcophagus. And if you happen to be claustrophobic, you would really want to die quickly. Otherwise, it was a slow, miserable death. And that is featured in this story. It is one of my favorite stories. Funnily enough, it's also one of the stories that Bram Stoker's son told his grandsons, my cousins, who are alive today. And they thought it was gruesome, but they thought it was very cool. And so this is the first adaptation from one of Bram Stoker's short stories into a graphic novel that Chris McCauley and I have done. And we brought on board a very talented actress who's played in Doctor Who and a number of other stage productions in London, but she's also a very talented artist. Her name is Jessica Martin. And we've got an incredibly talented Italian artist who did our cover for us. Chris McCauley is very talented at figuring out how you reduce the script into these little bubbles and panels. And then his wife, Bonnie, not a lot of people think that doing the lettering in a comic is that hard to do. It is hard to do. Yeah. It's hard to get it just right. Where do you put the words so you don't cover up all the action? And so this, for me, was an incredible learning opportunity. And I knew I wanted to do it, Adam. I knew a few years ago it was time, because when I'd go to all these conventions, when I'd give all my lectures at places, even though they were audio-visual, and I knew the visual was important to people nowadays to sort of see where these stories come from, feel it, taste it, touch it, and all that, I'd see thousands of people flocking to where the artists are. I'd see lots of people at the gaming tables and figuring about games, and I figured I gotta crack that market, mostly because I think Bram Stoker's lesser known works would get some traction and attention. And finally, it's a bit of an irony and not all that well known, Bram Stoker himself was an amateur artist. He was a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club.
Oh, wow.
And I have found, along with a very well-known collector in Dublin, we found during the pandemic online in an auction 5 sketches attributed to Bram Stoker. Not sold, but they are ones that were, let's just say, hanging around the family, made their way to somebody who was helping one of Bram's brothers, and they made their way to their family, and they finally put them up to auction, and we gobbled them up. So
Wow.
It's right that Bram Stoker, being the artist that he was, his works are finally, with the help of Chris McCauley, Jessica Martin, Esther Cardella, and Bonnie Dixon, and my help, are coming to light as pieces of graphic novels.
I think that's incredible. One of the things, it's really interesting. Every time that we talk about, what you're doing and your works, I know we focus a lot on Bram, but I just find it so fascinating, the historical side of it, that you've gone to all these different, you've traveled, you've done these things, you've probably, I mean, like, in my opinion, you probably talked with more people than anybody. Well, for sure, anybody that I know, you've talked with more people about who want to be involved and want to do these different projects and whatever than anybody else I know. And I know it sounds crazy because it's wonderful to have Bram's works come to light and people to be able to, like, a new generation to be able to see it. I feel like it's so interesting because I know we want to be like, it's like, hey, I'm not going to lie, I would love to be a best-selling author or whatever, but I don't write because I am just solely focused on trying to sell books. I write because I love it. And then, as you're talking about these things that you're doing, it's apparent you love it. You have this passion for it, and I love that. I mean, like, that's just, it's so crazy because a lot of people after you've been doing this for a while, a lot of people kind of, they get burnt out, they get tired of, doing things, and they just don't have that drive to continue and, to be consistent with it day after day. And I always find it fascinating because every time we talk, you just seem so invigorated by it. And I love that. I just love that about you, Dacre.
Well, thank you. And it is invigorating because I'm never doing this, the same thing over and over again. And, I've got friends that I write with that are very good at that. J.D. Barker, for instance, was amazing. We'd have brainstorming sessions. I'd give him outline notes. I'd give him research notes, historic stuff, and boom, 4 days later, I'd get back 3 chapters, and he could just totally focus in single item and get it done. On the other hand, I'm more like I spend a couple hours on doing research for this, a couple hours doing this, go for a bike ride so I can get some exercise, come back, a couple more hours on something else, contacting somebody in Romania because, like nowadays we're not running tours, but normally we are, and we're trying to put our tours together to different places in Romania, trying to do the same thing in Scotland, in Cruden Bay, Scotland. And when you've got other people that you're working with, and that's the beauty of what I'm doing, is that even though I'm not the sole writer of almost anything I do, but I'm part of a team that is the glue that keeps things together and sort of stokes the fire with research and up-to-date information, and let those people that are much better writers than I am do their thing. And so that way I can be sort of almost like the guy conducting the orchestra, recognizing that all these other people have more talent in areas than I do, but they need somebody to bring it all together. And I love that. I love the feeling of accomplishment. I love helping other people achieve their own goals. It makes me feel good. And this kind of goes back to my teaching days, and my coaching days. It's very similar to what I'm doing now. I just like doing this stuff a little bit better.
Oh yeah. And I have to say this much. I've read several of your nonfiction pieces, and I feel like you're a very good writer as well. I know that you don't necessarily do the fiction stuff, but you do provide that glue for, like, for example, with J.D. Barker, his cadence matched and mirrored Bram's cadence. I mean, like, it felt like Bram Stoker wrote it. I don't feel like he could have done that necessarily without the partnership that y'all had.
No, you're absolutely right, and I recognize that. And JD had read some of his earlier work, and then when we discussed it, and we said, JD, why don't you go and get books on Audible, even though it's not Bram Stoker reading it. JD loves to go out with his dog and go jogging a couple miles. He'd put his headphones on and he'd listen to different people reading Dracula, different people reading some of the other books. That helped JD get into it. And so it's like, I couldn't have done that myself, not a chance. But helping JD do it and finding the right guy that could do it, yeah, that's where I can come in.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I love nonfiction stuff. I mean, like I told you before, I love the historical side of things. I love, the nonfiction side. That's what I find fascinating. Don't get me wrong, I love Dracula too. I love the story of Dracula, but I find Bram Stoker's story just as fascinating as I do Dracula. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you the next sort of nonfiction story that is coming down the pipeline for us, and then you'll probably have to go and give my buddy Chris McCauley a call. But after the Virgin's Embrace, I mean, it's out now. It's doing great. We've got some very good reviews. We've already started working on, and I think you may remember me telling the story in my Stoker on Stoker lectures, the story that Bram's mother told him, which was the true story of her surviving the cholera epidemic of 1832 in Ireland. And this lady was, she was a natural storyteller, like many, Irish are, Adam. She told this story to Bram when he was a young boy. He was so taken by it. I'm sure it probably horrified him because it involved misdiagnosis, premature burial, a neighbor of theirs dragging herself out of the grave after being misdiagnosed. The family of Stoker, they weren't Stokers at the time, they were the Blake family, having to try to escape from their town to get away from the cholera, and they were met in another town by a militia with bayonets and forcing them back, burning all their stuff in a town square. So this story, Bram asked his mom to type it up and send it to him when he was a bit older and wanted to use it for the basis for a children's story that he was writing that made its way into his first book of fiction, Under the Sunset. And the story was called The Invisible Giant. That typed up story is sitting in the Trinity College archives, and I have got pictures of that. I have transcribed it, and Chris McCauley and Jessica Martin and Esther Cardella, the same team from the Virgin's Embrace, are turning that into our next graphic novel. A true story, a true story that I am convinced had an impact on Bram Stoker's young psyche, creating his dark sense of imagination that sort of sat in the back of his head somewhat, let's just say somewhat dormant, until he started doing all his research at the London Library that we just talked about vampirism and bodies coming out of the graves, and all these things came together for him while he was starting to write the novel. And so again, it's like Bram using some reality and some fiction, just like I do, and making one heck of a story. So the Charlotte Stoker cholera horror will be coming out by our publisher Andrews, a UK publishing. Probably sometime in the next probably 3 months, because we're just getting going. It takes a long time to get all the little pieces. I have been in contact with the Stoker Sligo Society. I've actually been there and met them. They are providing me with some information for an article to go in this little story. So just like the Virgin's Embrace, we're going to have the real story that Bram wrote. We're going to have the real words that Charlotte wrote. We're going to have the introduction. We're going to have the graphic novel. We're going to have the artist actually telling a little bit about what the story is all about. We're going to have the article by Dr. Marion McGrady and Fiona Gallagher about what really went on historically, and how well it matched up. And they actually say that Charlotte Stoker's account is one of the most factually correct accounts of the 1832 cholera epidemic in Western Ireland that exists. So it all blends in together. Yeah.
That is amazing. Well, this has been a wonderful chit chat. I've really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the next hour as well, Dacre. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you so much. I got to give you a warning.
Yeah. I got to give you a warning. Chris McCauley is a bit of a vampire.
Oh, really? Okay.
He lives in Edmonton, Alberta. He's Irish, but he hardly sleeps. He works for gaming companies. He has got these incredible hours. He also has an incredible aversion to garlic. He's very allergic to garlic. And because he has these crazy hours, he's got a resistance to, he has an aversion to sunlight. So
okay, all right.
Just be careful. You're safe in Savannah as I am in Aiken, South Carolina, and he's
For
in
now.
Edmonton. But
For
just
now.
be ready for him.
I
He's
mean,
a
if
great
Dracula
guy,
could come across the pond, all right? Awesome.
Very creative and a wonderful guy. Be ready for him. Here we go.
That's awesome. All right, everybody.